Hello, Overthinkers. I am so excited to have with us today Professor Jing Iris Hu. Dr. Hu is a professor at Concordia University in Montreal, and you are here to talk to us today about Confucian ethics.
Yeah.
So, just to get us started, as I'm like finding my notes, can you tell us a little bit about the basics of Confucian ethics and what you think is most distinctive about it? I know you've written an article on this recently, and it's also part of some of your other work.
Yeah. Well, so first, disclaimer, there's just so much things to say about Confucian philosophy, partially because it's a living tradition, meaning that it's still changing, still developing, and still goes on, it's still influencing people. And it is also has a history of over 2,000 years. Sometimes people don't think about this, but the name Confucianism comes from one philosopher, Confucius.
Yeah.
But the whole tradition is named after him, Confucianism. So it would be like, the equivalent would be like if we're talking about today's Western philosophy, we call it Platonism. So when you ask me what's going on in Confucianism, I would be an imposter to say, oh, I know everything that's going on in Confucianism, right? But I think in some of my work, I think one of the most distinctive feature of Confucianism is that it really focuses on the influence we have to other people and how other people influences us. So, and I think this is something that's somewhat under-theorized in contemporary philosophy. We sometimes just kind of assume we're a moral agent. We're just gonna exercise our will. Whatever I decide is the worst thing to do, I'm going to do it. We kind of acknowledge, of course, I influence you, you influence me, but we don't really theorize that much. So personally, I think that's the most interesting aspect that I'm focusing on, that how, let's say, setting things into a positive start or maintaining a positive feedback loop is such an important thing to maintaining relationships and also to sustain our own moral agency.
Well, that's a really interesting way of putting it, because in talking about this loop, it's not as though we are these individual agents who are sort of just like pushing back and forth on each other, but it sounds like it's a much more dynamic notion of interdependence. So wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that. How is it that moral agents are not only sort of impacting each other, but shaping each other, influencing each other in that deeper way? And also, I know one thing that you often hear about Confucian ethics is the importance of roles. And so how do roles fit into this? Social roles that are imposed upon us by others, fit into the shaping.
Yeah. So this is very interesting. I'm going to answer this in two parts.
I guess it was a two-part question.
So the first one is the feedback loop. It's kind of a little bit misleading to say it's a loop, because it's not necessarily a loop. It could be that today when I was headed over into the hotel, so we're at the Pacific APA.
Yeah, we're at the American Philosophical Association conference in Portland, hence like a sort of sterile room.
Right. So as I was heading into the hotel, I saw a number of colleagues who were waving at me and smiling at me. So this started a positive start of my day in a way. And then I go on to see some of other colleagues. Some of them I may know, some of them I don't know, and I also waved at them and I'm smiling. So that positive energy also gets to pass on to them. So in a way that the person I influenced are not necessarily the person who initially influenced me. So it's not really a loop, but instead we want to think, well, maybe it can be something that just kind of spreads, like a pro-social tendency. But on the other hand, I think you're definitely right that different roles are very important. That my role as a daughter, as a scholar, and as a woman, they're all the roles that I occupy in society. But I think anyone who talks about roles, we would have to recognize that they really shape who we are and how we behave. But obviously, sometimes they constrain us as well. Especially if they are, roles in not necessarily designed, but have implications that would restrain people one way or the other, sometimes aligning with oppressive ideology.
Yeah, and how do you navigate that then? Because it strikes me, based on what you're talking about, that relative to some of the Western, we might say, or European traditions of philosophy, where there is perhaps more of an emphasis on autonomy, especially if you're thinking about the Kantian tradition of ethics, there is a sense of sort of your, as I mentioned earlier, kind of interdependence on others, or maybe this sense of what you call in some of your work on this, the vulnerability of being a moral agent. And I think, so that suggests to me that there's perhaps more blurred lines, and tell me if I'm wrong on this, between ethics and social and political philosophy from the Confucian standpoint. And it also suggests to me, I think precisely what you're saying is kind of a double-edged sword almost. This idea that there's a recognition of our dependence on others and of the sort of knock-on effects that transcend our intentions in the moral sphere, but then that also can lead to some people feeling constrained by certain oppressive social roles. So how do you respond to that feeling constrained? Are there, tools within Confucian ethics to think about that? And also, does it make sense to talk about that as a blurring of the lines between ethical, social, political?
Yeah, I think you're definitely right that the early Confucians, for them, the ethical, the moral philosophy and political philosophy is tightly tied together. Because they live in a time period there were constant wars between different states to each other. So one of the background conditions is that most of philosophers during that time, they really want to persuade the powerful people to stop launching wars against each other. So some of them want to say, well, we are innately good individuals, so you should cultivate the good beginning or good potential in our heart. So Mencius, one of the Confucian philosopher who talked to powerful kings and telling them, well, you should develop the compassionate aspect and think about your people who are suffering, right? Who is going to say goodbye to their son, to their husband, never know if they're going to come back because they're being drafted. Of course, as a philosopher, that task did not go very well. The king eventually just said, well, I'm too weak of a person. I can't do that. I'm just gonna go on with my military aggression. But anyways, I think there are some tools in the Confucian tradition precisely because they do theorize the roles and the influences that we have and then that sustains us. Because if we don't think about them, they are still there. We are still living in roles, right? And they are still imposing on different expectations on us. If we don't think about them, we don't theorize them, does not mean they are just gonna go away. So I do think that theorizing this, especially very subtle features of our interaction, of our moral life, is actually extremely useful when we think about some of the limitations we face because of social norms or social roles that impose on people.
Do you have any favorite, you're talking about some of the thinkers that are speaking to kings during the early periods of the warring states, and you mentioned Mencius or Mengzi in that context. Do you have any favorite texts that you would recommend on this point about the social roles, or maybe there's an example or something that you find kind of encapsulates this theme that you'd recommend for folks?
So I'm going to recommend. Well, the Analyze is always there.
Yes,
the
classic.
So Mencius has a book which is called Mencius.
Yes.
So personally, one thing I've been looking at is something that's really interesting. Is this one woman thinker? Her name is Ban Zhao, and she was this daughter of a famous historian.
During what period?
This is in the Han Dynasty, so this is 2nd or 3rd century BC. So She is the daughter of this super famous historian, and then her whole family are historians. That's that's kind of like her family business, right? So they're all like historians. And then after her father passed away, and she kind of stepped up to say, I'm going to be the scholar, the historian, to document things. So which she did. So she's really credited as a very important woman historian, woman scholar. One of the interesting things is that she was able to do that because she said, this is my father's mission. So I am doing it not because myself fulfilling feelings, right? Yeah. But because I am a filial daughter. Yeah. So I need to follow my father's wishes, right? My family's legacy. And then, in addition to that, though, she wrote this other thing, which is called Lessons for Women, or 女戒, right? So it's not a long text, but throughout the text, she talks about how to establish oneself as a individual with their own moral ideas. Then she also talks about how to conduct yourself with ethical standards. Also how to fill your own roles in a nice and graceful way so that you don't bring shame on you and your family. Yeah. It's and there are also some of the more specific things, such as that how do you deal with sister-in-laws? How do you deal with mother-in-laws?
Oh my gosh, how to deal with mother-in-laws. Like, yes. We need to share this with people. I think a lot of people would benefit.
Yeah. Well, long story short, for the women of that historical period, I think their mother-in-laws are kind of like their boss. It's kind of like in a professional setting, that's your boss, right? Because the family household is where the women were active.
Okay, yeah.
So I think Ban Zhao's approach is that you should always show grace, even if things don't go well. This is a very important, interesting part. I don't necessarily always agree with the things Ban Zhao said, because obviously she was a super privileged woman scholar back 2000 years.
Yeah, 2000 years ago.
yes, so I don't agree with everything she said. But she seemed to think that, well, if you always behave in a way that shows your own moral standing, and even if when other people behave in ways that fall short of that, you can still react in a way that reflect your own moral standing instead of their, instead of the nature of the attack, right? So then it will be good. So in a way, it's not very satisfactory to look at it.
Yeah.
She said, well, when they are not nice to you, just be nice.
Yeah.
Right? It's not very, but I think there is one other aspect to it, because unlike a lot of the other roles like father-son, which is the core idea of Confucian ethics, the father-son relationship, father-son, brother and brother, and friends, and presumably male friends. Right? Okay. So unlike those, the daughter-in-law and mother-in-law relationship is actually really interesting. This is brought up by one of the philosophers based in Singapore, So Hong Tan. Because initially you were basically strangers. You don't know each other at all, right? Then the woman, the young woman, would be married into the mother-in-law and husband's family, right? So their whole social relationship roles with their own natal family would shift entirely.
Because she would move in with them.
Yeah. So in a way, this woman growing up, they always know that roles are temporary, right? In a way that their male peer, do not think that. Yeah.
Oh, that's fascinating. And I think this leads me to think a little bit more about the role of moral cultivation in this framework, because you have talked in your work on this about the emphasis of learning and education, and so just thinking in terms of the changeability that you just mentioned, and it's fascinating that is actually something that an ancient woman thinker was thinking about more than these ancient male thinkers. Right. But so I'm curious about what is the process of cultivating yourself as a moral agent here, whether and maybe it's changed over time too, because as you mentioned, like there's the living tradition today, right. Contemporary Confucian philosophy, ancient, obviously many historical periods in between.
Yeah, I'm mostly focused on the classical period. Yeah. So that's in the 5th and then 5th, 6th and then 4th century BC. Mm-hmm. So I think all of this are tied together, I promise, in one way or the other. So I think the moral cultivation aspect is it's one of the most important foundation of Confucian ethics. I would argue one other is the naturalistic assumption of ethics. Then it's the moral cultivation.
Okay, and I want to come back to that too.
So the moral cultivation is important for many different ways. The Confucians would think that, the Tian or the heaven, even though I think heaven is a terrible translation because it does not have any Christian connotation. Yeah. So Tian is kind of like this force, supernatural force. It's not a place you can go to. It's a force, right? Okay. So the Tian kind of like bestow moral meanings in us. Mm-hmm. And the sages, like the people who are more advanced than us, morally speaking, right? So they kind of figure out some of the things, then they starting to teach the rest of us. And the things they figure out are the rituals. The rituals are supposed to work like grammar that would help us to speak, right? So we can still freely express our meaning, but we do need certain constraints, some basic functions, right? Basic structures, without which we wouldn't be able to communicate very well. So with those, they can help us to improve ourselves, right? So they have the assumption, mentions that Xunzi, they debate on whether human nature is good or bad.
Yes, I was going to ask you about that too. I love teaching that debate. It's so fun for students.
But both of them actually agree that you may be innately bad or innately good, but you still have to cultivate yourself. Yeah. So philosophically, I think the essence of that is because self-cultivation really allows us to maintain our moral agency. You mentioned autonomy earlier. Yeah. There is a distinction, I think, in Confucian philosophy. There is a sense of autonomy. So one of the speakers, Justin T-Word, who was just here, who I also did a podcast with.
Oh, great! Can you quickly tell us, or we can link it in the.
Yeah. You can so tell us it's after. Called "This Is the Way."
Oh yes. Oh my gosh, yes, so this podcast is a new podcast on Asian philosophy, right? Yes. I haven't had a chance to listen to it yet, but I'm so excited to, and also by the time this video comes out, there will probably be even more episodes. By the time of recording this, it's still very new. But anyway, okay, so yes, we'll definitely check that out. This is the way.
So, he was talking about autonomy in the Confucian tradition, which one of the features is that it is something you gain. It is not something to be assumed. Whereas I think in some of the contemporary ethical tradition, we just kind of assume we're autonomous individuals, right? Yeah. Like I'm autonomous, you are autonomous. Yeah. Right? We're all autonomous. And the moment we turn 18, magic number. We're
age of minority done. Yeah.
So in the Confucian tradition, the autonomy is something you gradually gain through self-cultivation. So I was talking to you about influence, right? Yeah. So one worry could be that, what if I don't have my own opinion? I just get influenced by people all over, right? Like today you tell me this, and it's like, okay, that's good. And then the other day I meet someone else, and they tell me something completely different. I'm like,
you see a TikTok, and you're like, oh, that person's right.
Exactly, right? So this is very concerning super relevant to our modern time, right? What if we get influenced too much, right? So that's where the self-cultivation would come in, actually. Well, we are welcoming influences, but we also reflect about our moral life. We also read the classics. Then we think, who who do I actually admire, and who do I actually want to be?
Yeah.
Right? Maybe at the moment I laughed at a joke when I watched this TikTok video, but maybe at the end of the day I'm like, actually it did not sit very well with me. Even though I laughed at the moment, I probably should not.
Yeah. So maybe a kind of critical reflection on the influences that you're taking in.
Yes.
Yeah, which is, I think, an interesting way to think about moral cultivation too, and it seems very important and right one to me as this recursive process of cultivation over time, which is why, you often hear that Confucian ethics is a virtue ethics, and it sounds like, that's probably, fair to say here. And I'm so glad you brought up Mengzi and Zhuangzi's debate between whether human nature is good or not, because I think following that, I want to just briefly touch on the naturalistic or naturalizing element that you alluded to, because certainly this idea that we are almost like unfolding according to our natural patterns seems to be something that you hear about sometimes with Confucian philosophy, especially in the context of the sprouts or the hearts. So could you tell us a little bit about what these sprouts or hearts are and how that's naturalistic?
Yeah. So here we're moving to philosopher Mencius, right? So he's the person who is really keen on the metaphor of sprouts. So he has the view that human nature is good.
Yeah.
So we're all relieved to know that. But he also thinks that the reason why he called human nature is good is because he thinks that we have innate moral dispositions. Things such as when something really bad happened to an innocent person, we feel bad, right? And when something, when we see injustice in society, we feel angry, right? So, or when someone trying to treat us in extremely demeaning manners, we perceive there's something that's very wrong. We either resist it or we remove ourselves from the situation. So those things he thinks are the very, very basic tenets of morality. So specifically he mentioned 4 things. Compassion, heart of compassion, the heart of a sense of shame, heart of right and wrong, and the heart of propriety. But the idea, though, I'm not going to go too much into the 4 different sprouts, but the idea is that we have something in us, and they're not mature or articulated in any ways, and they certainly can be manipulated, right? Just because I have compassion in me does not mean I'm always a good person. I could be sympathizing with like a serial killer, right? That's also compassion. So those sprouts need to be cultivated so that eventually they become more mature moral qualities. So I know I should feel compassion to the right people who deserve it, right? But he thinks that human nature is good because he thinks that those 4 different sprouts, which are really they really define who we are, even though we could question, is that the case, right? But I think that's where he starting to introduce his normative theory into his simile naturalistic understanding. So these 4 sprouts defines who we are, defines human nature, and then they all showed some kind of propensity towards pro-social reactions. So that's why he thinks that human nature is good. And one very important feature David Wang, a philosopher based at Duke University, would keep talking about is that if you think about it, it's a very dynamic picture. So the sprouts, they could grow, right? And then they could grow, and sometimes they do not grow. And sometimes if you have the sprouts, they could grow, they could take the wrong way around the rock or something, and eventually towards the sun, something like that. So, but when you look at the sprouts though, what you see is potential, and it sees potential and tendency. There's a tendency there. There's not a promised end goal there, because there just isn't, right? Because one other example Mencius would later use, another metaphor, is he thinks that human nature is good, like water falling down. So he would also say, well, the water, you could, it does not always fall down, right? You could contain it, right? You could contain it, or you could splash it, it would go upwards,
Mm-hmm.
right? But he said, well, despite all of that, it always have the tendency to go down, right? Even if it's not going down right now. So what he kind of presents, at least this is my interpretation, is that there is a very dynamic picture of human nature. We have the good, virtuous version of us in mind, which is great, but between who we are at the beginning versus the virtuous and version of us that we can be, there's just really a lot of dynamic things going on.
Okay, and I wonder too, so this is so interesting to think about in terms of the cultivation as well, because it sounds like the notion of the sprouts or of the water naturally falling down suggests that we are good if we don't interfere with that, or we will become good if we don't interfere. And so I wonder, what's the line between interference and cultivation? Like, how do you know if you're trying to cultivate compassion? How do you know what the difference is between letting that natural tendency to grow towards the sun happen versus like interfering with it?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, because Mencius actually does not think that, you know, we can just be left to our devices.
Yeah, I guess the sprout needs like water, you know, all this good stuff, dirt.
Yes. So that's where the self-cultivation and rituals would come in again. Right. So he would think that, well, we innately have all these moral propensities, but we need this whole Confucian program to transform us into virtuous individuals, right? So it's in a way that on one hand, human nature is good, then on the other hand, he is able to explain why some of us turn out not to be good.
Yeah, so that self-cultivation is always happening by virtue of rituals, you know, community, learning, etc.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
So when you don't have that, or when the individual just didn't want to cultivate, right?
Yeah.
Then you become, your sprouts dies out, basically. They are spoiled.
Okay, yeah, so we shouldn't be looking for self-cultivation as like this inner work, but instead as like putting the right conditions in place for us to thrive.
Yes. I think the short answer is yes. The long answer is a paper.
Okay. Well, maybe I'll ask a broader question about the history here, because you mentioned at the beginning that Confucian ethics is about as helpful a term as Platonic ethics for the entire, you know, Western or European tradition of ethics, which we never call Platonic ethics. We call it all of these different things. And so I wonder if you could just say a little bit, I know you said that you specialize in ancient Confucian philosophy, but if you could share a little bit with us about like what some of the trajectory has been in the over 2,500 years that Confucian ethics has been around. Like if you see a couple of particular moments that are really interesting, or if there's like some super short historical narrative with a lot of asterisks that we could offer. And also whether you think Confucian ethics is a term we should even be using, or whether there's something you'd rather replace it with.
Yeah, so this is such a great question. So I think we have to go back to the year of 1840.
Okay.
So when the Opium War ended, this is a war that happened between Britain and the Qing. At the time, it was the Qing dynasty. So that was the Qing dynasty was the ruling the family that ruled what is China now. So after that, one of the treaty as the end of the Opium War was that they were able to send many missionaries to Hong Kong and then to some of the other areas that eventually the treaty agreed to open up to the British. So the missionaries, they went there, they went to Hong Kong, and they went to some of the other places like Shanghai and Hankou. And they found out, well, there's this local ideology, right? It's Confucianism. Well, there's also Taoism and then Buddhism. But there's a natural connection almost between Confucianism and Christianity. Because it has this, family structure and the virtues like benevolence, sense of, shame, propriety, and so on and so forth. It's like a system very familiar, right? So that's why we end up, if you think about Confucius, right? It's not really Chinese, right? Mencius is not Chinese. It's a Latinized name.
Yeah.
Right? But everyone else has their original Chinese name, right? So Xunzi,
Oh yeah,
right?
yeah.
Xunzi, Xun is the family name, Zi is the honorary title. But then Han Beizi, or in the Taoist tradition, Lao Zi, right? And then Zhuangzi, they are all like, that's not Latinized.
Yeah.
The only two persons.
Yeah, are Mencius and Confucius.
Exactly. So I think that shows how much they favored these two philosophers.
The one that thought human nature was fundamentally good and the originator of the entire tradition.
Right. So Xunzi said human nature is bad. So
Yeah.
we don't want to hear more about that. So Confucius and Mencius, and then that is where the whole tradition is starting to get to referred as Confucianism.
Yeah.
Which is a little bit strange if you think about it, because everyone after Confucius is called Confucianism. Okay, that can still make some sense, right? But then there are people also before Confucius.
Oh, they were called Confucius.
Confucian philosophers. Yes, like Confucius' teacher, right? Or people who influenced Confucius himself.
Okay.
And then we were like, oh, okay, you guys are also Confucian.
Socrates is Platonic.
Exactly. Exactly, right? So it's not exactly fair. So there are scholars, I think one is Song Bing at Washington College. He argues that we should just use the term the school of Ru, which is the original Chinese term, because in Chinese we also don't call the whole tradition Confucianism. It's not named after Kongzi. We don't call it school of Kongzi.
Okay, yeah.
We call it Rujia, meaning that Ru is kind of like scholarly philosopher.
Ah.
Yeah. And then Jia means school, right? School of thought or family of thought. So Ru is the term to refer to all these people.
Okay.
And later on we got people like Wang Yaming, Wang Fuzhi. They don't necessarily agree with every single thing that had happened in the tradition, but obviously they are considered a scholar of the Ru school of thoughts, because obviously they're also Ru, right? They're the scholars.
Yeah.
Scholars. So in that way, I do think that school of Ru might be a more apt name, considering especially the people before Confucius were thrown under the whole umbrella. However, I think in ordinary conversation though, because one thing is if we trace it back to the Chinese usage, right? But then on the other hand, in the English-speaking world, the study of Confucianism and also the conversation around Confucianism has also been around for more than 100 years.
Yeah.
Right? So it's kind of starting to be its own tradition. And you talk to people who are influenced by Confucian tradition, and then they would say, well, I've always thought of it just as Confucianism.
Okay.
Right? So I do think there is, you could say, well, if we really want to trace back to the original language and be super faithful to it, yes. But then I want to also acknowledge the other side of it that has been in the English tradition, that has its own life, that has its own development, that has always used the term Confucianism. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, that's super helpful. And so you have your essay Confucian Ethics that's out in the Bloomsbury Handbook, and then a number of other publications on this.
Yes. On shame, on role ethics.
Of course. Yeah. And any other things that you want to just like any recommendations for further reading on this besides your publications that you would suggest? I think it's totally valid to suggest your own publications.
Yeah. No, so I would first suggest my own publication. I got one paper on shame. I think it's really a timely topic.
Totally.
Especially I think it's liberating in a way that it direct us to look at the social aspect that would breed shame, instead of just looking into our own selves.
Okay.
See what's the reason of shame. But so in addition to the Confucian traditions, one thing I've always found to be super fascinating is actually the Taoist tradition.
Yeah.
So the Taoist tradition, the book of Tao and De, and then also I think a lot of people I know were fascinated with this text called the Zhuangzi. because there are rich metaphors and then all kinds of stories that they are also kind of open to interpretation. For example, at the very, very beginning of the text, Zhuangzi talks about this gigantic mystical creature of a fish.
Mm-hmm.
He said the fish is so big, right? It lives in the northern sea. Then one day it just transforms into this gigantic bird that would fly 900 miles above the ground. So after this transformation, then Zhuangzi talks about, well, think about that gigantic bird and think about a little squirrel, right? Their perspective of the world are entirely different.
Yeah.
The little squirrel would not necessarily worse, right? Not necessarily in the worst situation, but the little squirrel would know the details of, you know, when you fly from the ground to a tree, right?
Mm-hmm,
Maybe know every branches or which branch is the one that it can land on. But the giant bird, he has no idea of those smaller things, right? You get like a view of what the world is like from up there.
Yeah.
But you're also missing out on some of the other things.
Totally.
So the perspectives are entirely different, but it's not meant to discourage us to say, hey, what I know is different from what you know, so we can never converge.
Just like a relativism. Yeah.
Exactly. But actually what I think, my interpretation, and some of the other people's interpretation, I don't want to take some credit for it, is that he is trying to push some kind of a boundary to say that, well, we should always be receptive and empty our own minds to recognize our perspective is not the only one that's out there. And it does not have to be the only one that makes sense or the one that's superior. If we are the giant bird, maybe we can pose our own perspective, try to do that for a little bit, think about what it's like to be that little squirrel, and vice versa, so that we would always be aware of our own obsession or biases. Yeah.
Well, thank you. So yeah, engaging in this kind of imaginative activity and in relation to these different social roles, I think is a great note to end on. So thank you so much for this conversation, Jing. It's been just a delight to interview you, and you can check out Dr. Hu's work online. And yeah, thanks so much for sharing.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's been a great time.
Yeah.
Bye, everybody.